every day, people like you and me witness paranormal activity. Many people suffer alone, afraid of telling their stories. Their encounters remain locked away, like skeletons tapping lightly on a closet door. Join me, Blake Lewis, as we peel back the veil of our reality, searching through silence. Good evening, children of the night. Full swing as this cryptic adventure takes hold and now surges forward with full steam ahead. It's officially in my blood. I'm going to continue to roll with the punches and pump out new content as long as you, the listeners, keep feeding me your encounters. I love what I'm doing. I'm bringing light into darkness where some are afraid to raise their voices. But enough of the banter. Time to gather your refreshments and climb into your covers, like you were diving under Harry Potter's cloak of invisibility. Why is that a thing? Why do we seriously feel so much safer under our blankets? Some deep-seated mythology that comforters are a natural shield against all form of entities. They're magical. Ask Tina and Glenn from Nightmare on Elm Street how well that strategy held true to form. All jokes aside, tonight's tale takes one's mind on a thrilling excursion over the hills and through the woods to a house from hell to play. It is an absolute hair-raising tale about a paranormal team eager to make their claim to fame, led by an ambitious soul named Chris, who bit off a little bit more than he could chew. A perfect tale to experience on a star-filled night while the moon is bright. The title of this story: Where Wolves Roam. My friends and I loved investigating paranormal locations. That's what we would always do. Throw ourselves into high-tension locations and pray we could squeeze any amount of evidence we gather online to get recognized for our accomplishments. There were only 3 of us in the group because we would try to emulate some of the other successful crews that you see on television shows. My friend then, Ben, was our main equipment technician and was mostly the one who was hands-on with all of our gear. Jennifer was in charge of looking for different locations for us to go and investigate, and would interview the individuals that we would investigate for. We would gather as much information as we could on locations before we would ship out to my garage. That was where we would do all of our strategic planning. It was early September and had recently been very difficult for us to find any leads on locations that seemed promising enough for us to even get any good evidence, and we almost gave up for that month until one of our friends had a story he relayed to us about his friends who also investigated locations. This one location in particular was on the outskirts of Rhode Island, in a heavily wooded area that had a broken down house that was known locally as Hell House. A typical name for a haunted location due to the locations obviously trying to build up the fright factor, but it sounded far too exciting. The thought of going out in the woods at night to investigate a broken down structure, our own little Blair Witch project? Jennifer immediately dove into finding out where the location was and got back to us the following day. She explained to us that the house was from the early 1900s, and there was a rash of paranormal sightings that have taken place ever since the house initially was built and drove the family from the location, fleeing into the nearby town. She told us that nearby hikers have claimed to see all sorts of activity in that area, including lights in the sky and screams bellowing from within the thick forest. It sounded like the dream location that we had all been searching for since we started our paranormal group, and we couldn't wait to plot out our trip the following week because we figured if there was ever a chance for us to gain any amount of notoriety within the paranormal community, it was going to be this location that put us on the path to obtain that ultimate goal. We had absolutely no clue what we were getting ourselves into. Nothing that we have come into contact with to this point with our experiences in the past had been physically frightening enough to ever question whether or not we were doing the proper thing. That week crawled. We were so eager to set out that it was the only thing we could think about and talk about. I had many menacing nightmares leading up to that day, though. Like some unexplained energy was trying to warn me to stay back and not pursue our endeavors. None of the other team members talked about nightmares leading up to the departure, so I kept mine to myself, but they all invoked darkness and dark entities circling around my house so fast, tearing through my metal garbage cans around the side of my garage and slamming into the garage door as if they were attempting with all of their might to have at me. The dreams were so real that I would always wake up in a puddle of my own sweat. I'm not even gonna lie. I started to become extremely fearful and took all of my visions as a bad omen. I just didn't realize then how truly connected I was to these inevitable events. But it's easy, in hindsight, to realize what you could have done or should have done different after the fact. In my mind back then, there was only moving forward. Our departure date finally arrived. It was September 11th, and one of the coldest days that we had that month. Jennifer mapped out the trip on MapQuest, and we set out on a 2-hour journey to our final investigation. Ben was driving and was beginning to have second thoughts about hiking into the woods to find Hell House, and voiced his overall opinion to both Jennifer and I. He was extremely nervous about getting lost, or worse, getting hurt while being out in the middle of the woods without any way of making sure we could find our way back to our vehicle. But Jennifer and I were having no part in hearing his warning and brushed his worries aside. It was midday when we showed up along the outskirts of our hiking adventure. We unloaded our gear and Ben went over all of the bags to make sure that we had all of our equipment. Jennifer had all the trail mapped out and estimated that it would take us about 24 minutes to reach the supposed location of Hell House. Before we set out, Ben pulled out a cigarette and inhaled it faster than I have ever seen anyone smoke a cigarette before. I could tell that his nerves were absolutely surging out of control as his shaking hands gave away just how frightened his state of mind was. I remember telling him to man up and not allow Jennifer to show more courage than he should have. I also remember the look that he gave me, like I was the biggest asshole. And he was right. Jennifer walked out from the side of the car with a bottle of vodka and plastic shot glasses. She said that it was for celebratory purposes, so we could take shots and pictures outside of the structure after our investigation to commemorate the achievement, and none of us objected to the gesture. She had no room in her bag, so we placed the bottle and the glasses into my bag and set out through the ominous forest. The walk leading up to Hell House was very peaceful for the first 10 minutes, with easily maneuverable tree gaps and not too much on the ground to trip us up. The last 15 minutes, however, was an absolute nightmare, just with how thick all of the branches were and how difficult it was to pull through wearing our packs. When we approached Hell House, I remember the gasping sound that came out of Jennifer. The sight was extremely eerie and put us all on edge, even with the sun illuminating the entire front section of trees that engulfed the house. It allowed us to record some amazing visual footage for the location to use for our walkthrough portion of the documentary, though. All of the trees were thick and towered over the roof, like the house grew out of the earth and permanently cemented its roots into the ground. It was awe-inspiring. It was the perfect haunted atmosphere, and we were far too excited, so we tore open our equipment bags, unpacked, and began to set up for our investigation throughout the night. Time passed so fast that, truthfully, I lost track of it. The trees were so thick above the house, it gave us ample time to record night shots around midday. Jennifer took it among herself to film outside shots of the house, while Ben and I began to investigate the second floor. For the first hour, we were getting great shots and prime footage of the inside of the house. The entire structure was decrepit. There was dust everywhere, and furniture broken into shards strewn about, with what looked like bloodstains from a victim that had been thrashed up against the corner of the room in the upstairs master bedroom. Just standing in that room gave me the worst chills that I immediately began to receive goosebumps surging up both of my arms simultaneously. We began asking questions out loud to any spirits who were present in the house and told them that they could come upstairs into the master bedroom and interact with us. We would stop periodically and listen to our recorders to see if we were getting any responses, but nothing had come through except for the sound of silence hissing on the tape recorder. Suddenly, we heard a large thumping sound echo throughout the downstairs toward the kitchen, and we immediately held our breath. Both of us looked at each other directly into the eyes with the same shocking expression on our faces, and I began to breathe heavily while whispering profanity to myself. Ben grabbed my shoulder and placed his index finger over his lips to tell me to keep quiet as we continued to listen for more aggressive sounds. Nothing. It was so silent, I could hear the blood pumping through my heart and feel the increasing rhythm of it beating out of my chest. Both of us were frightened to move because every little movement that we made, the floorboards creaked as if they wanted to cave in underneath of our weight. Ben finally had the thought of contacting Jennifer on the walkie-talkie to see if she was the sound that we had heard, but she immediately came back and explained that she wasn't even at the house and that she had gone out to take additional shots of the forest location for the intro of the documentary. We were alone, and it was golden footage. We continued to investigate and set out downstairs in the direction of where the thumping sound had come from. When we got downstairs in the living room, we had a perfect angle set up on the camera and managed to capture the entire living room and the open doorway of the kitchen area all in one shot. There was no furniture in the room, so the shot was dark and helpless feeling. We stood in the middle of the living room and began the next session with an additional set of questions. But this time, when we listened back, we could hear direct responses to our questions in succession.
Who's in here?
Why are you making all of this noise?
Why are you trapped in this house?
Both Ben and I looked at each other, and everything in the house changed. It was so different to explain. The walls seemed as if they began rippling like a pebble hitting a still lake, and the floor began to buzz under our feet. It lasted about 20 seconds. Ben suggested it was an earthquake, but I had felt tremors before. This was different. The air tasted like a penny, and all of my hairs were standing straight up like static on my arms. Something happened in that house that moment. We began to hear what sounded like wolves howling in the distance somewhere out in the forest. Jessica immediately climbed into my mind, and I thought to contact her on the walkie. But all that was coming through was static, hissing, and frighteningly hellish sounds from behind the radio waves. Ben was shaking fiercely at that point, and he began to hyperventilate. It was then that we noticed all of our equipment was dead. Every last piece of equipment. All of the batteries were completely drained. Right on cue, I was swallowed up by deja vu. Large slams and thrashing, carving sounds began to tear at all of the walls from the outside. Beastly growls that could straight curdle your blood were everywhere and carried so much bass, like the creatures whom they belonged to were massive in size and weight. We could hear the heavy strides around the outside of the walls, and that's when it hit me. This was what my nightmare was warning me about. Ben was unhinged at that point and broke for the front door to try to escape the madness, and I screamed at him not to open the door, but it was too late. He tore open the front door and darted onto the front porch, where he immediately caught sight of our nightmare creatures. His cryptic screams echoed throughout the forest so loud as he frantically ran back into the house and tried to slam the door shut, but one of the creatures pried its arm between the door frame, thrashing its deadly sharp nails around, trying to score any amount of flesh that it could within reach. Its arm was massive, larger than any arm that I have ever seen, and was so high up the door that the creature had to at least have been 8 feet tall. It was completely covered in hair, and the entire extremity was black, all the way to the tips of its claws. I bolted over to Ben's aid and drilled my shoulder into the door with every last ounce of determination I could gather to keep it from gaining access. But even with my added weight, it was pushing both of us back as if we were rag dolls. It managed to free enough space to pull its arm free, and the door slammed shut. Ben bolt-locked the door, and I grabbed his hood on his jacket and dragged him with me towards the basement door until he got hit and began to follow my lead. Just as we entered into the basement and closed the door, we heard the front door begin to take damage. The sound of wood chunks scattering about, windows smashing, and aggressive beastly panting bounced around the living room walls above us. We tried our best to not breathe, but it was no use because they immediately began to slam into the basement door as if they smelled our scent from a mile away. We dashed through the cellar and over to the external basement doors, turning the rusted latch halfway before it snapped altogether. Then we began to thrust our backpacks that we had been wearing into the door together several times to break through the eroded metal latch, and ran like madmen into the forest. When I glanced back, I saw one fly from the open doorway and another burst through the window above. Ben was running further ahead of me, but my adrenaline was surging so fast from seeing the creatures in pursuit, I caught up to Ben too quickly, and both our legs tangled as we crashed onto the floor, sending my pack flipping over top of my head, in between my chest, Ben's legs, and the thick foliage under us. My bag was soaked and smelled like pure alcohol, which immediately triggered the memory of Jennifer and I placing the bottle of vodka into my bag. Without any hesitation, I stripped the bag off of my back, reached into Ben's jacket pocket and pulled out his Zippo, flipped it open, and ignited my bag into flames and tossed it in the direction of the cracking branches. It instantly caught the dry shrubs on fire, and flames began to swallow the surrounding forest, illuminating the entire environment with pure chaos. That is when I saw one. As the others were fleeing from the blaze, one stood as angry looking as I have ever seen anything in my entire life. It glared at me for a moment, and I was trapped in fear. It was a classic werewolf. No other way to describe it. Straight out of The Howling. It opened its arms, crouching forward, and unhinged a menacing war cry, revealing its gaping wingspan while its head convulsed in the most frightening manner. I stumbled to my feet, grabbed Ben's pack, helping Ben onto his feet. We began to run the opposite way in pure darkness when all of a sudden we began to hear an extremely loud frequency that was shaking our bones, and felt a crazy magnetic pressure building up in the front of us as we continued to run. The air began to taste like metal again, and my eyes went blind. All of the static pressure went away, and we both fell face first from losing our balance with the release of the dense air pushing back at us, like we popped through an invisible barrier. Crashing to the floor again, we heard Ben's walkie screaming in alert mode, so he retrieved it from his pack and held the talk button while calling out Jennifer's name. When I looked back, there were no flames, just forest. No cracking sounds or nightmarish creatures in our pursuit. Just us. Jennifer answered us back and was sobbing in tears. She was so angry that we left her and couldn't get a hold of us, asking where we had been and telling us how scared she was, fearing that something terrible had happened to us. She had no clue. We never did become world-renowned investigators and lost whatever evidence we had caught at Hell House, but that location lived up to its name. That house was straight out of hell. Well, welcome back to safety, Chris. That story was insane, and I must say, I haven't experienced anything quite like that in my years. Yet. I'll say yet. I mean, because I seriously don't know what awaits me in my paranormal adventures to come, but hopefully none of them will drag my soul into interdimensional travel with ferocious werebeasts snapping at my ass as I run for safety. Nope. I'll pass. I'll stick to proton packs and high C juice boxes. They were the greatest. It was like a double shot of a liquid in there, and you could crush it in 0.2 seconds as you literally crushed the container and slammed it on the floor, tough as hell. Telling everyone you're 8.5. 8.5. I'm almost 9. I'm rambling. I hope you enjoyed tonight's program, and keep your ears tuned in for every drop that I have in the future that is coming. And don't forget, creatures, tell me your stories. Write me about your encounters, and I'll twist your real-life drama and dreams into a future webisode. Until then, stay safe, sleep well, and keep your wits about you.